Tonight on Ukraine Today, a historic operation by Ukraine's security service and the Navy. Ukrainian underwater drones have hit a Russian submarine in Novorossiysk. Security guarantees for Ukraine. What does the plan unveiled by European leaders include, and can it really be implemented? The most successful stage of the talks. What did Ukraine and the United States agree on in Berlin? Passions around Kremlin money. How does the European Union plan to bypass the veto of Putin's friends, Fico and Orbán? All this and more, right now. Hello, I'm Volodymyr Robchun and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe, like this video, and let's move on to the news. Let's start with a historic operation, the scale of which I think can be compared to the famous spiderweb operation. For the first time, the security service of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Navy used underwater drones to strike a Russian submarine in Novorossiysk. As a result of the explosion, the vessel suffered critical damage. We're talking about a Project 636.3 Varshavyanka, or improved Kilo-class submarine. On board, it carried 4 caliber cruise missiles launchers, which the enemy uses to strike peaceful Ukrainian cities and towns. So it turns out that even in Novorossiysk, the Russian fleet can no longer feel safe. Ukraine's general staff has confirmed a strike on the Astrakhan gas processing plant. Powerful explosions and a fire were recorded on the site. But that is far from all the bad news for the enemy.
Russia under attack, Moscow and the Moscow region were almost entirely on fire. On the morning of December 15th, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have shot down 130 drones, including 25 over the Moscow region.
There will be a blackout in major industrial cities of the Russian Federation, primarily in the Russian Black Earth region, and accordingly in Moscow. Moscow region. I do not rule out the possibility of strikes on power generation facilities in Krasnodar Krai and Volgograd Oblast. That is within the range of Ukrainian UAVs and Ukrainian Bayraktars.
The head of Belgorod region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, reported a missile strike on his region and serious damage to engineering infrastructure. Local public channels report a strike on the CHP, Combined Heat and Power Plant.
At the moment, Belgorod is effectively without power. The Russian authorities have been forced to acknowledge serious damage to what they call an engineering facility. This refers to strikes by the Ukrainian side on the Belgorod CHP.
It was loud because of the drone attack, according to Russian media reports in Rostov-on-Don. As a result, CHP-2 has ceased operations here. A raid was recorded at the oil refinery in Astrakhan, and the Astrakhan gas processing plant was also hit.
Throughout the entire period of the large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian drones have attacked oil and gas extraction rigs in the Caspian Sea, and this indicates an expansion in the geography of Ukrainian strikes. And starting from the new year, the production of 3 types is expected to scale up. Aeroballistic strike systems, specifically the Flamingo.
And this is already Ukraine temporarily occupied Crimea. Core fighters are destroying 2 enemy radar systems. In this footage, National Guard fighters are destroying a Russian Tunguska on the temporarily occupied left bank of Kherson. In the Pokrovsk direction, due to a lack of logistics, the occupiers are carrying gasoline themselves. But even that doesn't save them from Ukrainian FPV drones, which are always ready, so to speak, to lend a hand.
At the moment, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Ukrainian Defense Forces maintain a presence in 16 square kilometers of the city's total built-up area. Pokrovsk.
In 2 days, almost everyone was destroyed. A Russian soldier reports the situation from Kupinsk.
I don't know how many of us, Sasha, are left. That's why. This is our group.
The occupier notes that he and his comrades were sent to the slaughter, and it was their commanders who did this. In
Kupinsk, Russian assault groups totaling up to 200 people are blocked. There is no possibility for ground logistics. The main logistics are carried out using heavy UAVs. Moreover, the Russians themselves are posting videos on social media where Russian servicemen talk about how they took the last can of food, stew from an elderly Ukrainian woman, because for several days the whole unit has basically been surviving on just water.
In the footage shot on a GoPro camera, it's no longer Russian commanders, but Ukrainian scouts. The 92nd Brigade is clearing the forest belt of enemy forces. Short bursts, quick decisions, working without pauses. The result, -4 Russians, the soldiers write.
Over the past 24 hours, Russia has lost at least 1,150 occupiers, killed and wounded. That brings the total Russian losses since the start of the full-scale invasion to 1,190,620 invaders. In addition, over the last day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 9 Russian tanks, 6 armored combat vehicles, 67 artillery systems and dozens of other pieces of enemy military equipment. 3 people were injured as a result of a Russian attack on Zaporizhzhia. The occupiers launched a strike drone at the regional center. A Shahed drone hit a residential high-rise building. A fire broke out at the scene. And here are the images of a Ukrainian Yak-52 airplane shooting down a Russian Shahed over the coast of Odessa. The enemy drone was intercepted using a firearm. Talks between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump's special envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff have concluded in Berlin. Senior U.S. officials have already called them the most successful stage on the path toward a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Does this mean the United States has abandoned the idea of pressuring Ukraine? More on this, coming up next.
While Arefia continues to deprive Ukrainians of energy by shelling critical infrastructure and cities, Ukraine tirelessly searches for any possible points of contact that could bring the end of the war closer. And one of these steps was taken in Germany.
It feels like this is truly the last attempt. If this negotiation initiative fails, then everything returns to the battlefield. And
in Berlin, perhaps the most sensitive round of negotiations since the start of the full-scale invasion took place. Negotiations at which, for the first time, Ukraine publicly indicated that for the sake of ending the war, it is ready to consider compromises that until very recently were thought impossible.
In my opinion, the most important thing is that the plan should be as fair as possible, first and foremost for Ukraine. Because it was Russia that started this war, and above all, it must be feasible. The plan really shouldn't just be a piece of paper, but a significant step toward ending the war, quotes the New York Times, citing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
As reported by Western media, during 5 hours of negotiations, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to abandon the pursuit of NATO membership.
This was one of the demands of the Russian Federation. Zelensky is actively looking for common agreeable ground. And Zelensky is diligently seeking effective ways to thoroughly resolve the most challenging and difficult issues that currently exist today. And first and foremost, here is one of the options, taking into account the very tough position of the United States of America, which is absolutely against Ukraine joining NATO, as well as the reluctance of some European countries for us to join NATO, and the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO is extremely doubtful. And obviously the president has made this decision for himself, believing that it could make the Russian Federation more willing to negotiate. And the American side will see that we, on our part, are ready we have a serious constructive solution.
For Kyiv, this is a significant shift. Since the beginning of the large-scale war, Ukraine has consistently sought NATO membership as the only guarantee capable of preventing a new invasion. Moreover, this course was enshrined in the constitution. A year ago, abandoning it would have seemed politically impossible. From
the very beginning, Ukraine has sought to join NATO. This is a real security guarantee. Some partners from the US and Europe did not support this direction. Thus today there are bilateral security guarantees between Ukraine and the US. Guarantees similar to Article 5, which the US provides us, as well as security guarantees from European colleagues and other countries. Canada, Japan, this is an opportunity to prevent another one. A Russian invasion, Reuters quotes Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as saying.
However, this is precisely where
This is where the main disagreements truly begin to emerge and intensify. The primary recipients of substantial military and economic aid are indeed countries within the European Union. However, it is crucial to understand that Ukraine does not receive this vital assistance entirely free of charge. Instead, it is provided under specific conditions and often requires repayment or adherence to certain agreements, making it a more complex arrangement than simple donations. Ukraine receives it for the defense we are waging against the terrorist Russian regime, which threatens all of European security.
The American vision for ending the war is much tougher. It involves not only abandoning the course toward NATO, but also making territorial concessions, including areas in eastern Ukraine that are currently under Kiev's control. In one of the options proposed by the American side, there is even talk of creating a so-called free economic zone, a buffer between territories controlled by Ukraine and lands occupied by Russia. But behind this diplomatic term lies a simple question: who is supposed to leave and from where?
Right now, the American side is actually pressuring us into making serious compromises, most of which we are not ready to accept, because these compromises, they play in unison with Russian logic, and for us they are unacceptable and unconstitutional.
Obviously, this statement was received as quite a considerable surprise to Russia, the nation. The Russian side is now preparing its response, preparing its own proposal.
Unfortunately, again, we have no understanding of the chances for success, and this is because the Kremlin's position is the least clear and the least transparent. But even there, in the minds of the decision makers, there is some kind of formula regarding which losses, what kind of damage, what costs they are still willing to bear in order to achieve which goals.
Meanwhile, in Berlin, during the second round of consultations between the Ukrainian and American delegations, according to AFP, the American side continues to pressure Kyiv to give up Donbass as part of a possible peace settlement. However, for Volodymyr Zelensky, this issue still remains a red line that Ukraine is not willing to cross, even under pressure from its allies.
Territorial issues were discussed as well, of course. Let me remind you, Russia wants to obtain Ukrainian territories, even those it has neither captured nor controls. President Zelensky commented on this issue. At a joint press conference with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, he said the following.
I do not believe that the United States demanded anything. I see us as strategic partners. That is why I said that on the issue of territories, we heard information from the United States about Russia's vision or Russia's demands. We see this as demands of the Russian Federation. And that is why I could not demand anything from the United States either. Instead, I passed on to my colleagues in the United States our vision so that they could pass it on to the Russians. That is also why I said that there are sensitive issues. We exchange views, and we also hear about the Russians' vision or their goals. We are making efforts to explain our position, and I am glad that we are being heard.
For his part, Merz said that the United States is ready to take on legal obligations for security guarantees for Ukraine, similar to Article 5 of NATO. According to the Chancellor, the West will not repeat the mistakes of Minsk, referring to the Minsk agreements, which Russia ignored with impunity. Meanwhile, Politico reports that the United States has allegedly given Ukraine several days to agree on security guarantees. According to the publication, Washington is demanding a decision by Christmas. Otherwise, the terms may worsen. At the same time, the majority of Americans support increasing military aid to Ukraine, and 79% call Russia an enemy. These are the results of a recent poll in the United States. There are concrete factors showing that the U.S. supports Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression, no matter Trump's rhetoric.
The European Union has expanded sanctions against the Kremlin's shadow fleet. 5 more individuals and 4 companies involved in supporting Russia's shadow fleet have been added to the sanctions list. These are businessmen directly or indirectly connected to the state oil companies Rosneft and Lukoil. The latest package of sanctions demonstrates that Europe stands with Ukraine, and in the peace negotiations currently underway, pressure should be applied only to the aggressor country and not the other way around. In the old world, Germany is the driving force behind support for Ukraine. Chancellor Friedrich Merz is convinced that Putin will not stop at Ukraine in his aggressive foreign policy, which is why Europe must do everything possible to help the victim of aggression.
We firmly stand with Ukraine in order to achieve our common goals. To advance this work, we will continue to increase pressure on Moscow. And finally, we will also take tougher measures against the Shadow Fleet and continue to provide large-scale support to Ukraine. Above all, we want to use frozen Russian assets in Europe so that Ukraine can more actively defend itself against future Russian attacks.
Merz is convinced that Putin is interested in changing borders in Europe and restoring the Soviet Union within its former boundaries. Merz pointed out that this poses a huge threat, including a military one, to the countries that were once part of that empire. German analysts predicted that the Kremlin would be ready to attack NATO in 2029. However, the recent incursion into EU airspace, which is attributed to Moscow, suggests that the Kremlin may be preparing for an earlier attack. That is why Europe is obliged to help Ukraine in every possible way.
I want to tell you about NATO's position and what we must do to prevent a war before it even begins. And for that, we need to have a perfectly clear understanding of the threat. We are Russia's next target, and we are already in danger.
Britain and France are also taking an active pro-Ukrainian stance. Emmanuel Macron, before the negotiations in Berlin, wrote that he wants to achieve a just peace and security guarantees for Ukraine.
France is and will remain on Ukraine's side in order to build a strong and lasting peace that can guarantee the security and sovereignty of Ukraine and Europe in the long term. I thank all the Ukrainian, European and American negotiators who have mobilized to achieve this goal.
To ensure security guarantees for Ukraine from the United States in the event of a peace agreement, European leaders held a series of talks with U.S. President Donald Trump to clearly convey the European position.
I am quite confident that we will succeed. And after a phone conversation with President Trump, I got a firm impression that he is ready to move forward with us on this path, because he knows that the interests of Europeans must be taken into account, and we made this clear to him.
Pressure regarding Ukraine is being exerted on the US president from all sides. Recent sociological polls in the States have shown that the overwhelming majority of Americans support comprehensive aid to Ukraine.
Most Americans continue to support military assistance to Ukraine, despite the pro-Kremlin shift of Donald Trump's administration. In November, the number of Americans supporting arms deliveries to Kyiv rose to 64%, a record high since the start of the war, according to a nationwide defense survey conducted by the Presidential Foundation and the Ronald Reagan Institute. According to the survey, 79% of Americans consider Russia an enemy, and only 17% see it as an ally. Even among MAGA Republicans, the ratio is 74 to 21%.
The statements and actions of European leaders, as well as the pressure on Trump, show that the civilized world is on Ukraine's side, and in this case, one can count on a positive outcome from the lengthy negotiation process.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now's the time to subscribe, like this video and share it so more people can see it. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. European leaders have unveiled a security guarantees plan for Ukraine. Their joint statement includes the following. Permanent military support for Ukraine. The armed forces of Ukraine, and we are talking about armed forces only, should remain at up to 800,000 troops in peacetime to deter aggression and protect the country. A multinational force for Ukraine, formed within the coalition of the willing with U.S. support to restore Ukraine's armed forces, protect the sky and ensure maritime security with possible operations inside Ukraine. A ceasefire monitoring mechanism, an international monitoring team led by the United States for early warning of attacks, recording violations and responding to them. Legally binding security guarantees. In the event of a new attack, there would be an obligation to respond using military, intelligence, economic and diplomatic tools. Investment in Ukraine's recovery, funding for reconstruction, trade agreements and compensation for damages by Russia. Kremlin assets in the EU remain frozen. Support for Ukraine's accession to the European Union. And speaking of frozen Russian assets, EU leadership has developed a mechanism that would allow their use to support Ukraine, bypassing objections from Putin's friends Fico and Orbán. Up next, the real passions surrounding Kremlin money.
The reparations loan for Ukraine is getting closer. The EU has finally frozen Russian assets, eliminating one of the main dangers. It also deprives the Kremlin's main allies, Hungary and Slovakia, of the ability to block the transfer of money to Ukraine. Orbán is furious, but it's not surprising.
There's absolutely nothing surprising about this behavior. Orbán and his cronies are defending the Kremlin's interests against Ukraine. An anti-Ukrainian, Ukrainophobic policy is being pursued, aimed at forcing Ukraine to capitulate so that Orbán can gain certain assets as a result.
But let's take it one step at a time. For several months now, the EU has been searching for loopholes to provide Ukraine with a reparations loan from frozen Russian assets, each time encountering new resistance. But now a breakthrough is near. The European Union has prepared the technical framework to provide Ukraine with a reparations loan. The Council of the European Union has officially prohibited the transfer of frozen assets of the Russian Central Bank back to Russia, and has also decided on the indefinite freezing of Russian assets located in Europe. The latter means that the EU will not return the frozen assets to Russia until it pays reparations to Ukraine.
This guarantees that Russian funds amounting to up to 210 billion euros will remain within the EU until Russia fully compensates Ukraine for the damage caused. We will continue to increase pressure on Russia until it starts taking negotiations seriously.
Until now, the freeze was extended every 6 months, which in turn created the risk that the funds could be unfrozen at the most inopportune moment. For example, Hungary might refuse to support the extension of the freeze next time. This could result in a catastrophic scenario. The EU would have to return the money to Russia, but Russia has not yet paid war reparations to Ukraine, which would place the entire financial burden on the EU. Now that threat no longer exists. And as expected, Orbán was outraged that Hungary was sidelined from the decision-making process.
This is a declaration of war. Touching frozen Russian assets, appropriating them, this is a declaration of war. I've never seen a case where the seizure of 200 or 300 billion euros from a country didn't provoke some form of response. That just doesn't happen.
Such a jab at the EU did not leave Poland's foreign minister Radosław Sikorski indifferent. He reposted Orbán's message claiming that the European Commission is allegedly violating European law in broad daylight, and wrote that Viktor has earned his Order of Lenin. End of quote. Hungary's foreign minister Péter Szijjártó rushed to defend his boss. A real war of words began.
We understand that you very much want a war between Russia and Europe. We will not allow ourselves to be dragged into your war. If Russia doesn't invade again, there won't be such a war. But we understand that this time, you'll be on its side.
The head of Ukraine's foreign ministry, Andriy Sybiha, also responded to Orbán's statement very succinctly. He simply called Orbán the most valuable frozen Russian asset in Europe, and experts agree with this characterization.
Orbán is a puppet of the Kremlin. He recently went to the Kremlin and received instructions, so there's really nothing surprising about this. In fact, his foreign minister, Szijjártó, who is already being called not the foreign minister of Hungary, but of the Russian Federation, constantly stays in Moscow. And that's why Orbán and the entire current Hungarian government are completely under the Kremlin's control, carrying out all the whims dictated to them from Moscow.
But no matter how much Orbán stomps his feet, the deed is done. Now the EU won't be able to stop Hungary. The reparations loan is now closer to being approved. Now, the granting of the loan will be discussed at the EU leaders' meeting, which will take place later this week. The decisive vote on this issue belongs to the Prime Minister of Belgium. After all, most of the frozen Russian assets are being held in the Belgian depository Euroclear. But the EU has already warned, if Belgium continues to obstruct this issue, the same approach that was used with Hungary could be applied to it: removal from the decision-making process.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share. See you next time.